Velron was dying. The skies above its once thriving cities were streaked with sickly green, choked by toxins that blotted out its twin suns. Towers that had once stood as symbols of Velronian ingenuity now leaned like ancient skeletons against an unforgiving wind. From the ground, faint, desperate whispers carried the weight of a civilization teetering on the edge of extinction. The Xyath had come, and with them, they had brought ruin. Deep in the heart of the Galactic Alliance's headquarters, a hologram shimmered into existence. A Velronian figure, their face gaunt and eyes hollow, stared out at the council chambers. Their voice crackled with static but carried the unmistakable edge of despair. To any who can hear this, Velron is under siege. The Xyath have consumed our cities, our fields, our people. Please, we have no one else to turn to. Help us. The plea hung in the air, yet the room remained silent. The assembled delegates, a mix of alien races, each as different in form as they were in philosophy, shifted uncomfortably. Finally, one delegate, a being with 6 luminous eyes and an elongated face, broke the silence. Velron's fate was sealed the moment the Xyath landed. To intervene now would be folly. Their resources are depleted, and any effort to aid them would end in the loss of more lives. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. Species known for their wisdom, diplomacy, and even bravery nodded solemnly, unwilling to face the Xyath. No one dared to challenge their reasoning, except the representative of humanity. Captain Naomi Greaves, humanity's liaison to the Alliance, stood abruptly. So, we're just going to let an entire species die because it's inconvenient? That's what we're doing now? Her tone was sharp, a contrast to the diplomatic decorum the Alliance prided itself on. Some delegates bristled, their features darkening in disapproval, but she pressed on. We've faced the Xyath before. We know what they're capable of, and we know they can be stopped. The 6-eyed delegate turned toward her, his tone cold. And how many humans perished in that conflict? Surely even your impulsive species understands the cost of such actions. Naomi didn't flinch. We understand it better than most. That's why we're not afraid to do what needs to be done. The chamber descended into chaos, arguments erupting from all sides. But Naomi wasn't interested in their opinions anymore. She pressed a button on her wrist console, sending a signal to humanity's flagship, the Tempest. Far from the polished chambers of the Galactic Alliance, aboard the massive dreadnought orbiting a distant star, Commander Jax Rylan received the message. The holographic display before him flickered to life, showing the Velronian's plea for help. Jax leaned forward, his sharp blue eyes narrowing as he replayed the transmission. To his left, Lieutenant Mira, his second-in-command, crossed her arms. The Alliance already said no. Are we really going to stick our necks out for this? Jax didn't answer immediately. His gaze lingered on the hologram, on the desperation etched into the Velronian's face. Memories he'd buried long ago stirred. A Velronian medic pulling him from the wreckage of a crashed transport. Their kindness, the only reason he was still alive. He owed them. We're going, he said finally, his voice steady. Mira exhaled sharply. With all due respect, Commander, this isn't just another mission. The Xyath wiped out an entire human colony in less than a week. If we engage them now... We're not discussing this, Jax interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. He stood, towering over the small command console. Prepare the crew. We leave within the hour. The Tempest was humanity's pride. A hulking behemoth of steel and firepower, built not just for war, but survival. As the crew mobilized, its corridors buzzed with controlled chaos. Soldiers checked their weapons, engineers ran diagnostics, and pilots reviewed escape routes. Jax strode through the ship, his presence commanding but calm. In the war room, holographic maps of Velron flickered to life, displaying the planet's surface and the ominous red swarms representing the Xyath. Jax's senior officers gathered around, their faces a mix of determination and apprehension. The Xyath have encased Velron's atmosphere in a swarm of bioships, Jax began, pointing to the map. Breaking through will be the first challenge. Once we're on the ground, we'll assess the situation and prioritize 2 objectives: evacuating survivors and neutralizing the Xyath infestation. One of the officers, a grizzled veteran named Carter, frowned. "And what if there are no survivors?" "There are survivors," Jax replied firmly. "That's not up for debate." The room fell silent, the weight of the mission pressing down on them. Jax scanned their faces, knowing what they were thinking. The Xyath weren't just another enemy. They were a force of nature, consuming everything in their path. But Jax had faced impossible odds before, and he wasn't about to stop now. "We've got the tools, the training, and the guts to pull this off," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "If the Alliance won't step up, we will. Let's remind them what humans are capable of." A ripple of resolve passed through the room. They might have been outnumbered and outgunned, but they were human. And if there was one thing humanity was known for, it was their refusal to back down. The Tempest shuddered as its engines roared to life, the hum of power coursing through the ship like a heartbeat. From the observation deck, Jax watched as the stars shifted, the ship preparing to enter hyperspace. Mira joined him, her expression softer than before. "You're really staking everything on this," she said quietly. Jax nodded. "They need us. That's all that matters." Mira studied him for a moment before nodding. "Then let's make it count." As the ship jumped into hyperspace, the view transformed into a kaleidoscope of swirling lights. For a brief moment, there was silence, a calm before the storm. But Jax knew better than to trust it. The Xyath were waiting, and Velron was running out of time. In the distance, the faint sound of the Velronian's plea replayed in his mind. "Please, we have no one else to turn to. Help us." Jax tightened his grip on the rail, his jaw set. They would answer the call. The Tempest emerged from hyperspace like a predator stalking its prey. The vast expanse of Velron's orbit lay before it, but it wasn't the peaceful starscape the crew had hoped for. Instead, the planet's skies were veiled by a pulsating organic swarm of Xyath bioships. These grotesque alien constructs twisted and writhed as though alive, their surfaces shimmering with a viscous, oily sheen. They hovered, like vultures, feeding off the dying energy of Velron itself. In the command center, a sharp intake of breath rippled through the crew. On the main display, the bioships loomed larger than life, their twisted forms radiating menace. Lieutenant Mira leaned over Jax's chair, her voice low but tense. "Well, Commander, I'd say they know we're coming." Jax stood, his eyes scanning the tactical map projected before him. It showed a writhing mass of bioships clustered tightly around the planet. The red markers were so dense that Velron itself was barely visible beneath them. His jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "They're not expecting a fight," Jax said. "The Alliance would have turned back by now. That gives us an edge." "An edge?" Mira raised an eyebrow. "That's an entire swarm out there, Commander. You're saying we can sneak past that?" Jax's lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile. "I'm saying we won't need to sneak, but we will need to be smart." He turned to Carter, the grizzled veteran who had seen more battles than most of the crew combined. "Get me a full readout on the bioships' movement patterns. I want to know where they're thinnest and how fast they respond to threats." Carter nodded, already tapping away at his console. "On it, Commander." Jax gestured to Mira. "Prepare the ship for evasive maneuvers. Full shields, but keep weapon systems offline for now. Let's not tip our hand until we have to." The crew sprang into action, their training evident in the precision and speed with which they moved. The Tempest wasn't just a warship, it was a finely tuned instrument of survival, and every person aboard knew their role. As the tactical map updated, Carter let out a low whistle. "They're moving in a grid pattern, Commander. Looks like they're circling the planet in shifts, but there's a gap in their rotation every 7 minutes. It's not much, but it's something." Jax studied the map, his mind already working through the possibilities. The Xyath were creatures of efficiency, their movements precise and calculated. That was both their strength and their weakness. "We'll exploit that gap," Jax said. "But we'll need a distraction to draw their attention away from us." Mira frowned. "What kind of distraction?" Jax tapped a point on the map, highlighting a derelict satellite orbiting just outside the Xyath swarm. "That satellite still has a functioning power core. If we overload it, It should create enough of an energy spike to pull their attention. And if it doesn't? Mira asked. Then we'll improvise, Jax said simply. The plan was set into motion with the kind of precision that only came from years of experience. A small drone was dispatched to the satellite, carrying a modified power coupler. As the drone approached its target, the crew held their breath. The Xyath swarm shifted slightly, their movements almost serpentine, but they didn't react. Drones in position, Carter reported. Initiating overload, now. On the main display, the satellite flared to life, its core glowing brighter and brighter until it exploded in a blinding flash of light. The shockwave rippled outward, and the Xyath bioships reacted instantly, converging on the source of the disturbance. They're taking the bait, Mira said, a hint of relief in her voice. Good, Jax replied. Take us through the gap, full speed, but keep it smooth. We don't want to attract attention. The Tempest surged forward, its engines humming with controlled power. On the main display, the tactical map showed their path cutting cleanly through the opening in the Xyath swarm. The crew worked in tense silence, their eyes darting between their consoles and the viewports. Just as they were about to breach the planet's atmosphere, an alert blared through the command center. One of the Xyath bioships had broken off from the swarm, its bulbous, pulsating form hurtling toward them. Looks like one of them wasn't fooled, Carter muttered. Jax's eyes narrowed. Arm forward cannons. Target the bioship's propulsion nodes. We need to disable it before it calls for reinforcements. The Tempest surged forward, its engines humming with controlled power. On the main display, the tactical map showed their path cutting cleanly through the opening in the Xyath swarm. The crew worked in tense silence, their eyes darting between their consoles and the viewports. Just as they were about to breach the planet's atmosphere, an alert blared through the command center. One of the Xyath bioships had broken off from the swarm, its bulbous, pulsating form hurtling toward them. Looks like one of them wasn't fooled, Carter muttered. Jax's eyes narrowed. Arm forward cannons. Target the bioship's propulsion nodes. We need to disable it before it calls for reinforcements. The Tempest's weapon systems roared to life, sending a volley of plasma fire streaking toward the bioship. The alien vessel twisted in an almost organic fashion, dodging some of the shots, but a direct hit to its propulsion nodes sent it spiraling off course. Nice shot, Mira said, her tone grim. But we're not out of the woods yet. That thing's still operational. We don't need to destroy it, Jax replied. Just keep it off our tail long enough to reach the surface. Prepare for atmospheric entry. The Tempest plunged into Velron's atmosphere, the friction igniting its shields in a fiery display. The Xyath bioship followed, its grotesque form undeterred by the turbulence. The crew braced themselves as the ship shook violently, the harsh winds of Velron's upper atmosphere threatening to tear them apart. Shields holding at 80%, Carter reported. But that thing's gaining on us. Jax's mind raced. They couldn't afford a prolonged engagement, not this close to the surface. He glanced at the tactical map, noting a series of jagged mountain ranges below. Take us into the canyons, he ordered. We'll use the terrain to our advantage. The Tempest banked sharply, diving into the narrow, winding canyons that scarred Velron's surface. The Xyath bioship followed, its movements eerily fluid despite its bulk. The chase was a deadly dance, the alien vessel firing bursts of acidic projectiles that splattered harmlessly against the Tempest's shields. Keep us low and unpredictable, Jax instructed, and prepare the aft cannons. Let's see how well it handles a surprise. As the Tempest rounded a sharp bend, Jax gave the order. The aft cannons fired a concentrated burst of plasma, striking the bioship squarely in its exposed underbelly. The alien vessel shuddered violently before crashing into the canyon wall in an explosion of biomatter. The command center erupted in cheers, but Jax held up a hand. Save it for later. We've got a planet to save. The Tempest emerged from the canyons and touched down in the desolate remains of a Velronian city. The crew began preparations for the next phase of the mission, their adrenaline still running high from the chase. As Jax stepped off the ship and onto Velron's poisoned soil, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Above, the Xyath swarm continued to twist and writhe, a reminder of the danger that still loomed. For now, they had made it through, but the real fight was yet to come. The city of Velron stretched out like a graveyard, a hollow remnant of what had once been a bustling hub of life and innovation. Crumbling spires and twisted ruins jutted out of the landscape like broken teeth, the occasional flicker of fading energy conduits serving as a ghostly reminder of the civilization that had thrived here. The sky above was no better, blanketed in a sickly green haze that cast everything in a dim, oppressive glow. Jax Rylan stood at the base of the Tempest ramp, the poisoned soil crunching beneath his boots. His eyes scanned the horizon, his expression grim. The air here was heavy, each breath tasting faintly of ash and decay. The crew behind him was silent, the weight of the mission pressing down on them like the toxic atmosphere above. "Lieutenant Mira!" Jax called, his voice cutting through the quiet. Mira jogged down the ramp, her gear clinking softly as she adjusted her rifle strap. "Commander, deploy the recon drones. I want eyes on every corner of this city," Jax ordered. "If there are survivors, we'll find them. If there's a Xyath nest, we'll burn it." "Yes, sir," Mira replied, already turning to relay the command to the tech teams. The Tempest's advanced recon drones launched one by one, their small, sleek forms zipping into the sky and spreading out across the ruined city. Jax watched them for a moment before turning back to Carter, who was reviewing the tactical map. "What do we know so far?" Jax asked. Carter frowned as he adjusted the display, pointing to a dense cluster of red markers moving along the outskirts of the city. "The Xyath bioships are still swarming the upper atmosphere, but we've got ground activity too. Small clusters, likely drones or scouts moving in erratic patterns. They're probing, Commander." "Looking for survivors?" Jax guessed. "Or us," Carter replied grimly. Jax nodded, his expression hardening. "Then we'll need to move fast. Where's our best chance of finding survivors?" Carter zoomed in on a section of the map near the city center. "Here. Looks like some of the larger structures are still intact. If anyone's alive, they're likely holed up there." Jax studied the map, his mind already calculating the risks. The central district was a good distance away, and between them and their target lay countless potential threats. But it was their best shot. "We'll take a ground team," Jax said. "Keep the Tempest on high alert. If the Xyath show up in force, I want us ready to launch at a moment's notice." Mira returned, her expression tense but focused. "Recon drones are picking up movement. Northwest quadrant. Could be Velronians, but it's hard to tell. The signal's weak." Jax's eyes narrowed. "Then let's go find out. Carter, you've got the bridge. Mira, you're with me." The ground team moved through the ruined streets with practiced precision, their movements silent and deliberate. The Velronian city was a maze of collapsed structures and eerie silence, every shadow and corner a potential threat. The occasional distant screech of a Xyath drone echoed through the ruins, setting everyone's nerves on edge. Jax led the group, his weapon at the ready. Mira flanked him, her sharp eyes scanning for danger. Behind them, a small squad of Marines moved in formation, their helmets casting faint glows as they monitored their surroundings. As they approached the central district, the recon drone feed in Jax's HUD flickered. A faint signal appeared, a cluster of heat signatures inside a partially intact building ahead. "There," Jax said, motioning toward the structure. "Looks like we've got survivors." The team picked up their pace, moving swiftly but cautiously. The building loomed before them, its once grand facade scarred by time and destruction. The faint glow of energy shields shimmered across the entrances, a sign that someone had been fighting to keep the Xyath out. Jax stepped forward and activated his comms. "This is Commander Jax Rylan of the human dreadnought Tempest. We're here to help. If you can hear this, respond." For a moment, there was nothing but static. Then a voice crackled through the channel, weak but resolute. "Commander Rylan, this is Calveris. We've been holding out here for weeks. If you've come to save us, you're late." Jax allowed himself a small smile. "Better late than never. Hold tight. We're coming in." "Lieutenant Mira," Jax called, his voice cutting through the quiet. Mira jogged down the ramp, her gear clinking softly as she adjusted her rifle strap. "Commander, deploy the recon drones. I want eyes on every corner of this city," Jax ordered. "If there are survivors, we'll find them. If there's a Xyath nest, we'll burn it." "Yes, sir," Mira replied, already turning to relay the command to the tech teams. The Tempest's advanced recon drones launched one by one, their small, sleek forms zipping into the sky and spreading out across the ruined city. Jax watched them for a moment before turning back to Carter, who was reviewing the tactical map. "What do we know so far?" Jax asked. Carter frowned as he adjusted the display, pointing to a dense cluster of red markers moving along the outskirts of the city. "The Xyath bioships are still swarming the upper atmosphere, but we've got ground activity too. Small clusters, likely drones or scouts moving in erratic patterns. They're probing, Commander." "Looking for survivors?" Jax guessed. "Or us," Carter replied grimly. Jax nodded, his expression hardening. "Then we'll need to move fast. Where's our best chance of finding survivors?" Carter zoomed in on a section of the map near the city center. "Here. Looks like some of the larger structures are still intact. If anyone's alive, they're likely holed up there." Jack studied the map, his mind already calculating the risks. The central district was a good distance away, and between them and their target lay countless potential threats. But it was their best shot. "We'll take a ground team," Jack said. "Keep the Tempest on high alert. If the Xyath show up in force, I want us ready to launch at a moment's notice." Mira returned, her expression tense but focused. "Recon drones are picking up movement. Northwest quadrant. Could be Velronians, but it's hard to tell. The signal's weak." Jax's eyes narrowed. "Then let's go find out. Carter, you've got the bridge. Mira, you're with me." The ground team moved through the ruined streets with practiced precision, their movements silent and deliberate. The Velronian city was a maze of collapsed structures and eerie silence, every shadow and corner a potential threat. The occasional distant screech of a Xyath drone echoed through the ruins, setting everyone's nerves on edge. Jax led the group, his weapon at the ready. Mira flanked him, her sharp eyes scanning for danger. Behind them, a small squad of Marines moved in formation, their helmets casting faint glows as they monitored their surroundings. As they approached the central district, the recon drone feed in Jax's HUD flickered. A faint signal appeared, a cluster of heat signatures inside a partially intact building ahead. "There," Jax said, motioning toward the structure. "Looks like we've got survivors." The team picked up their pace, moving swiftly but cautiously. The building loomed before them, its once grand facade scarred by time and destruction. The faint glow of energy shields shimmered across the entrances, a sign that someone had been fighting to keep the Xyath out. Jax stepped forward and activated his comms. "This is Commander Jax Rylan of the human dreadnought Tempest. We're here to help. If you can hear this, respond." For a moment, there was nothing but static. Then a voice crackled through the channel, weak but resolute. "Commander Rylan, this is Kale Varus. We've been holding out here for weeks. If you've come to save us, you're late." Jax allowed himself a small smile. "Better late than never. Hold tight. We're coming in." The team approached the shielded entrance where a makeshift barricade had been constructed. As they got closer, the energy shield flickered and dropped, revealing a group of Velronians huddled inside. Their eyes were wide with a mix of fear and hope, their once pristine robes now tattered and stained. Kyle, a young Velronian with a determined look in his eye, stepped forward. "You're humans," he said, his tone somewhere between amazement and skepticism. "Last I checked," Jax replied. "We're here to get you out." Kale's expression hardened. "It's not that simple. The Xyath, they've taken the rest of the city. We've been trying to hold them off, but we're running out of time, out of people." Jax glanced around at the haggard group of survivors. There were maybe 20 of them, most looking too weak to stand, let alone fight. His jaw tightened. "Then we'll buy you more time." Kale studied him for a moment, as if trying to gauge his sincerity. Finally, he nodded. "We've fortified this area as best we can, but it won't hold forever. If you've got a plan, we'll follow it." Jax turned to Mira. Get the comms team to sync with their defenses. I want a full assessment of their shields, weapons, and supplies. We'll use what we've got to reinforce their position. Mira nodded and began coordinating with the tech team back on the Tempest. Meanwhile, Jax turned back to Kale. What about the Xyath? Where's their main hive? Jax asked. Kale's expression darkened. Deep underground, beneath the old energy grid. That's where they're nesting. But going there is suicide. Jax's lips pressed into a thin line. We'll see about that. Before Kale could respond, an alarm blared through the building. A Velronian soldier stumbled into the room, his face pale. They're coming! The drones! They found us! The tension in the room snapped like a taut wire. Jax turned to his team, his voice sharp and commanding. Everyone to defensive positions. Mira, get those shields back up. Kale, show us where to set up firing lines. The Velronians scrambled to follow Jax's orders, their fear tempered by his calm authority. The humans moved with practiced efficiency, setting up barricades and aiming their weapons at the entrances. Outside, the sound of the Xyath drones grew louder, their guttural screeches echoing through the ruined city. Jax stood at the center of the room, his weapon trained on the main entrance. His voice was steady as he called out to his team, "Hold the line. No matter what comes through, we hold." The first drone burst through the shattered doorway, its twisted, insect-like body glinting in the dim light. Jax's shot was precise, a burst of plasma fire reducing the creature to smoldering pieces. But behind it came more, a swarm of grotesque, writhing forms, intent on consuming everything in their path. The battle for Velron had begun. The battle raged within the ruins of Velron's central district as Xyath drones poured through the shattered entrance. They came in a relentless swarm, their grotesque forms twisting and pulsating as they moved. Each one emitted a shrill, otherworldly screech, their glowing eyes locked onto their targets. The survivors and the human ground team fought side by side, their determination shining brighter than the dim, green-tinted light around them. "Hold your ground!" Jax shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Plasma fire erupted from his rifle, the bright streaks of energy slamming into the Xyath drones with precision. Each hit sent a drone crumpling to the ground, its body writhing in a final spasm before falling still. Mira fired from behind a makeshift barricade, her shots swift and deliberate. "Shields are holding at 50%, Commander, but they're not going to last long if this keeps up." Kale, standing nearby with a small group of Velronian fighters, gritted his teeth as he fired a primitive energy weapon. Its blasts were far weaker than the human arsenal, but the determination in his movements was unmistakable. "They're testing us. The Xyath always probe before they overwhelm." Jax's jaw tightened. "Then we'll give them a reason to back off. Mira, concentrate fire on the bottleneck at the main entrance. Kyle, I need your people reinforcing the eastern flank. If they breach that wall, this position won't hold." Kyle hesitated for a moment, glancing at Jax as if weighing his trustworthiness. Then, with a curt nod, he barked orders to his fighters in the melodic cadence of Velronian speech. They moved swiftly, taking up positions along the crumbling eastern wall. "Carter, report!" Jax called over comms as he fired another volley into the swarm. "Ship scanners are picking up more movement in your area," Carter replied from the Tempest. "Looks like they're sending reinforcements. You've got 10 minutes, tops, before you're completely surrounded." Jax cursed under his breath. "We don't have 10 minutes. As if on cue, the barricades at the main entrance buckled under the force of the drones pressing against them. A particularly massive Xyath creature, a crusher, as it was known in human reports, smashed through the weakened defenses, its bulbous body exuding a noxious mist. The air grew thick, forcing several fighters to cough and stagger back. Jax wasted no time. He grabbed a grenade from his belt, activated its charge, and hurled it directly at the crusher. The explosion rocked the room, sending shards of alien exoskeleton flying in all directions. The massive creature collapsed with a wet, gurgling roar, but more drones surged forward to take its place. "This isn't sustainable," Mira called out, her voice strained. "We need to fall back." "No," Jax replied sharply. If we fall back now, they'll overrun the survivors. We hold here no matter what. Kale, overhearing the exchange, stepped closer to Jax. His voice was tense but resolute. You fight like you have something to prove, human. Why are you risking so much for a people you don't even know? Jax didn't look at him, his eyes fixed on the swarm as he fired another shot. Because I've been here before. I've seen what happens when the Xyath win. I won't let it happen again. The weight of Jax's words hung in the air, cutting through the chaos of the battle. Kale studied him for a moment longer, then nodded silently and returned to his position. The fight dragged on, the air thick with the acrid smell of burning drones and the muffled cries of the wounded. Despite the overwhelming odds, the combined efforts of the humans and Velronians began to turn the tide. The swarm thinned, the relentless onslaught slowing as the surviving drones regrouped outside the building. Looks like they're pulling back, Mira said, her voice tinged with cautious relief. For now, anyway. Jax lowered his weapon, his body still tense as he surveyed the room. The cost of the skirmish was evident. Several Velronians lay injured or worse, their makeshift barricades now little more than piles of rubble. His own team bore fresh wounds, exhaustion etched into their faces. Kyle approached, his posture weary, but his eyes fierce. You held the line? I didn't think anyone could stand against them like that. Humanity's good at standing when others can't, Jax said simply. But this was just the first wave. They'll be back, and next time, they'll hit harder. Kale gestured toward the wounded. We've already lost so much. If you have a plan to stop them, now's the time to share it. Jax motioned for Mira to join them, and the three of them gathered around a portable holomap that Mira activated. The glowing display showed the city and its surrounding areas, along with the underground tunnels where the Xyath were believed to be nesting. Their hive is here, Jax said, pointing to the map. If we take it out, we can cut them off at the source, but we'll need to reinforce this position first to keep the survivors safe. Kale frowned. You want to go into the tunnels? That's suicide. Only if we're not prepared, Jax replied. The Tempest has enough firepower to make a dent, but we'll need precise coordinates to hit their central structure. That means recon teams. I'll go, Kale said, surprising both Jax and Mira. I know these tunnels better than anyone. If you want to strike the hive, you'll need me to guide you. Jax studied him, his expression unreadable. This isn't just about you. If something happens to you down there, your people lose their leader. Kale's gaze didn't waver. If we do nothing, they lose everything. I won't hide while the Xyath devour what's left of my world. Jax nodded, respect glinting briefly in his eyes. Then we move fast. Mira, get the engineers on fortifying this position. Double the shield output, patch the barricades, and set up automated turrets. I want this place to hold no matter what. Mira saluted. On it, Commander. Kyle turned to rally his fighters, many of whom looked uncertain but determined. The energy in the room shifted, a flicker of hope igniting in the eyes of those who had been on the brink of despair just moments before. As the preparations began, Jax stepped aside, activating his comms to contact Carter aboard the Tempest. Carter, we need a full supply drop at these coordinates. Ammunition, medical supplies, and explosives for tunnel work. And get me a detailed scan of those underground structures. I want to know exactly what we're walking into. Roger that, Commander, Carter replied. But you're cutting it close. The swarm's still active in the upper atmosphere. If they pick up our supply drones, they'll come straight for you. Then make it fast, Jax said. We don't have time to waste. As the comm line went silent, Jax turned back to the survivors and his team. The Velronians moved with renewed purpose, patching walls and distributing supplies, their fear replaced by a glimmer of determination. The humans worked alongside them, their efficiency and expertise lending strength to the fragile alliance. Jax allowed himself a brief moment to take it all in. They had survived the first wave, but the real fight was still ahead. The Xyath were relentless, and this would only be the beginning. But for now, they had hope, and Jax intended to see it through to the end. The eerie calm that followed the first wave of the Xyath assault weighed heavily on everyone inside the fortified building. Survivors tended to the injured while Mira and the engineers worked tirelessly to reinforce the defenses. Despite the brief respite, the tension in the air was palpable. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the Xyath returned, stronger and more determined. Jax stood at the center of the room, studying the holomap Mira had set up on a salvaged console. The map displayed the layout of the Velronian city, the tunnels beneath it, and the concentrated red swarms that marked the Xyath's forces. Beside him, Kyle watched intently, his posture stiff with both fatigue and determination. "We're buying time, not winning the war," Jax said, his tone grim but steady. "We can hold this position for now, but it's not sustainable. If we don't take out their hive, this entire planet is lost." Kyle's voice was quiet but firm. "We've been fighting them for weeks, Commander. We've seen what they do. Their hive isn't just a nest. It's alive, connected to every drone in their swarm. Destroying it won't be easy." "It's never easy," Jax replied. "But we're not here because it's easy. We're here because it's necessary." Kale glanced at him, a flicker of respect crossing his expression. "You humans have an odd way of doing things. Most species would have written us off just like the Alliance did." Jax's jaw tightened at the mention of the Alliance. "Most species aren't us." Before Kale could respond, Mira approached, wiping grease from her hands as she joined the conversation. "We've got the shields up to 70%, and the barricades should hold against another wave. I've also set up automated turrets at the main entrance, but they're only good for a few hundred rounds before we'll need to reload." Jax nodded. "Good work. What about the survivors?" Mira glanced over her shoulder at the huddled groups of Velronians scattered throughout the room. Some were tending to injuries, others sharpening makeshift weapons or murmuring prayers in their native tongue. "They're scared, but they're not broken. I've seen worse." "Then let's keep them that way," Jax said. "Kale, get your fighters ready. We'll need all hands when the next wave hits." Kale hesitated, then nodded and turned to rally his people. Jax watched him go, a mixture of admiration and concern in his expression. He knew the young Velronian was stepping into a role he hadn't been prepared for, leading his people in the face of overwhelming odds. It was a burden Jax understood all too well. As Kale spoke to his fighters, Mira leaned closer to Jax. "You really think they're up for this?" "They don't have a choice," Jax said, "and neither do we." The hours passed in a flurry of activity. The humans worked alongside the Velronians, reinforcing defenses, distributing supplies, and preparing for the next attack. The atmosphere, while tense, was tinged with a sense of camaraderie that hadn't been there before. The two groups, so different in their cultures and capabilities, were beginning to work as one. Jax moved through the building, checking on the progress and offering words of encouragement where he could. He paused near a makeshift medical station, where a Velronian healer was tending to a wounded Marine. The healer's delicate hands moved with practiced precision, applying a glowing salve to the Marine's burned arm. "Your people are resourceful," Jax said, his tone genuine. The healer glanced up, her luminous eyes meeting his. "We've had to be. The Xyath leave no room for weakness." Jax nodded, understanding all too well. He moved on, his steps carrying him to the eastern wall where Kale was overseeing the placement of additional barricades. The young leader looked up as Jax approached. "You've got a good group here," Jax said, gesturing to the Velronian fighters. "They follow you because they trust you." Kale's expression was guarded, but there was a hint of vulnerability in his voice when he replied, "They trust me because I'm the only one left. My father, he was the real leader. I'm just trying to keep us alive." Jax placed a hand on Kale's shoulder, his grip firm but not overbearing. "Leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up when it matters most. And right now, you're exactly what they need." Kale's gaze lingered on Jax for a moment before he nodded, a flicker of resolve returning to his eyes. "What about you? What drives you to fight like this? Why risk so much for a planet that isn't yours?" Jax hesitated, his mind flashing back to memories he had long tried to suppress. The faces of his fallen comrades, the screams of civilians caught in the crossfire, the endless weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. Because I've seen what happens when no one shows up, he said finally. And I'm not letting it happen again. Before Kale could respond, a sharp alarm blared through the building. Mira's voice crackled over the comms. Commander, we've got movement. Swarms incoming, and it's bigger than last time. Jax's expression hardened. Everyone to positions. This is it. The Xyath came in waves, their drones swarming the building with feral precision. The automated turrets fired relentlessly, cutting through the first ranks of the assault, but the drones pressed on, undeterred by their losses. The sound of plasma fire and alien screeches filled the air, a cacophony of chaos and determination. Jax moved along the line, his rifle cutting down drones as he barked orders. Hold your ground! Don't let them breach the perimeter! Kale fought alongside his people, his energy weapon glowing brightly as he fired into the swarm. Despite their rudimentary weapons, the Velronians held firm, their resolve bolstered by the presence of their human allies. At the main entrance, Mira and a group of Marines held the line against a massive Xyath crusher. The creature slammed against the barricades with relentless force, its acidic mist corroding the metal supports. Mira shouted over the comms, her voice laced with urgency. We need heavy firepower on this thing or it's going to break through. Jax turned to Kale. You've got explosives, right? Kale nodded. Small charges, mostly for mining, but they'll do the job. Get them to the entrance, Jax ordered. I'll cover you. Kale didn't hesitate. He grabbed a satchel of charges and sprinted toward the main entrance, his movement swift and purposeful. Jax followed, his rifle blazing as he took down drones attempting to intercept them. As Kale reached the barricades, he planted the charges along the supports and set the timer. Charges set! 30 seconds! Fall back! Jax shouted, pulling Kale away just as the crusher reared back for another strike. The explosion rocked the building, sending shockwaves through the swarm. The crusher disintegrated in a cloud of fire and biomatter, and the remaining drones hesitated, their collective movements faltering. That's how we do it, Mira called out, her voice triumphant. But Jax's focus remained sharp. Stay alert, they're not done yet. The survivors cheered, their spirits lifted by the small victory. For the first time in weeks, they had pushed the Xyath back, but Jax knew the battle was far from over. The hive still loomed beneath them, its malignant presence a constant threat. As the dust settled, Kale turned to Jax, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. You've given us more hope than we've had in weeks, but hope won't be enough to win this war. Jax met his gaze, his voice steady. No, it won't, but it's a start. And for now, that was enough. The temporary victory over the Xyath provided the survivors with a brief but much-needed respite. Inside the fortified building, a sense of cautious hope hung in the air as Velronians and humans worked together to regroup and strengthen their defenses. However, Jax couldn't shake the feeling that the Xyath weren't just regrouping. They were planning something far more sinister. In the dim light of the holomap, Jax studied the latest scans from the Tempest. The data revealed an unsettling pattern. The Xyath forces in the atmosphere were converging on a single point above the city, and their ground forces had stopped their erratic probing, instead forming a tight perimeter around the tunnels beneath Velron. They're up to something, Jax muttered, his brow furrowed. This isn't their usual behavior. Mira stood beside him, her arms crossed as she analyzed the data. Could be they're waiting for reinforcements. Or baiting us, Jax said, his tone grim. They're smart. Too smart to waste resources unless there's a reason. Kyle approached, his expression tense but curious. What are you thinking, Commander? Jax looked at him, his mind working through possibilities. The Xyath Queen. She's the key to all of this. She's organizing them, controlling their movements. If we take her out, we cut the head off the snake. Kyle hesitated, his eyes narrowing. And you think she's in the tunnels? She has to be, Jax replied. Everything points to the hive being her base of operations. The drones, the bioships, they all operate like extensions of her will. Kale's jaw tightened. Then we're walking into her trap. Probably, Jax admitted, but it's the only way to stop this. If we don't take the fight to her, she'll overwhelm us eventually, We can't hold out forever." Before Cale could respond, Carter's voice crackled over Jax's comms. "Commander, you need to see this." Jax stepped closer to the console as Carter patched through a live feed from one of the Tempest orbital recon drones. The image displayed a massive Xyath bioship descending through the atmosphere. It was larger and more grotesque than anything they'd encountered before, its surface bristling with spines that pulsed with sickly green energy. "What the hell is that?" Mira asked, her voice tinged with unease. Carter's tone was equally grim. "We're calling it a mothership. It's heading straight for your location." Jax's stomach sank. The timing was too perfect. The Queen wasn't just planning an attack. She was preparing to end this fight once and for all. "She's coming for us," Jax said. "The Queen's sending her forces to wipe us out before we can make a move on the hive." Cale's voice was steady, but laced with tension. "Then we don't have much time." The fortified building buzzed with frenetic energy as both humans and Velronians prepared for the inevitable onslaught. The survivors moved with a newfound sense of purpose, reinforcing barricades, distributing weapons, and fortifying defenses with whatever scraps they could find. Jax stood in the center of the chaos, issuing orders with calm precision. "Mira, set up fallback positions at the secondary barricades. If they breach the main defenses, we'll need a place to regroup. Kyle, I need your people focused on keeping the eastern flank secure. That's our weakest point." Kyle nodded, his expression determined. "We won't let them through." The sound of distant screeches echoed through the ruins, growing louder with each passing minute. The Xyath were coming, and they weren't bothering to hide it. Carter's voice came through the comms again, this time more urgent. "Commander, that mothership's deploying ground forces, lots of them. You've got about 5 minutes before they hit your position." "Understood," Jax replied. "Keep feeding us updates." He turned to Mira. "This is it. We hold the line here, no matter what." Mira smirked, a hint of defiance in her eyes. "Wouldn't have it any other way." The first wave of Xyath drones descended on the fortified building like a living tide. They swarmed the main entrance, their grotesque forms clambering over barricades and turrets with relentless determination. The automated defenses fired continuously, plasma rounds tearing through the swarm, but it wasn't enough to stem the tide. Jax moved along the line, his rifle blazing as he called out orders. "Focus fire on the clusters. Don't let them swarm us." Cale fought alongside his people, his energy weapon glowing brightly as he picked off drones with precision. Despite their inferior technology, the Velronians held their ground, their resolve bolstered by the humans' presence. At the eastern wall, Mira and a group of Marines engaged a massive Xyath crusher. The creature's acidic mist corroded the barricades, forcing the defenders to fall back as it smashed through the weakened defenses. "We need heavier firepower," Mira shouted over the comms. "This thing's tearing through us." Jax turned to Cale. "Do you have more charges?" Cale nodded. "I'll get them." "No," Jax said firmly. "You're too valuable here. I'll handle it." Without waiting for a response, Jax grabbed a satchel of explosives and sprinted toward the eastern wall. The crusher loomed over the barricades, its massive form a terrifying sight. Jax slid into position behind a crumbling column, planting the charges along the structure's base. "Fall back!" he shouted to the defenders. "Get clear!" The charges detonated with a deafening roar, bringing the column down on top of the crusher. The creature let out a guttural screech as it was crushed beneath the rubble, its twisted body twitching before finally going still. Mira approached, her expression a mix of relief and admiration. "Nice work, Commander. That thing was a nightmare." Jax didn't have time to celebrate. The swarm was relentless, and the mothership loomed closer, its shadow casting an ominous pall over the battlefield. As the battle raged on, the Queen's plan began to reveal itself. The drones weren't just attacking. They were forcing the defenders to spread thin, dividing their forces and creating vulnerabilities. Jax could see it clearly, the way the swarm shifted and adapted with an intelligence that was unnervingly precise. "She's driving us into a corner," Jax said, his voice tight. "If we don't change the game, we're done." Cale, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, stepped forward. "What are you suggesting?" "We take the fight to her," Jax replied. "If the Queen's forces are all focused here, then her hive is vulnerable. We hit it now, while she's distracted. Kyle hesitated. And if it's a trap? It probably is, Jax admitted. But it's our best shot. Mira stepped in, her voice steady. You're talking about splitting our forces. If you go into those tunnels, we won't have enough people to hold this position. That's a risk we have to take, Jax said. If we don't stop her, this fight never ends. Kale nodded slowly. I'll guide you to the hive. Jax placed a hand on his shoulder. This is your chance to save your people. We'll finish this together. As the defenders prepared for the final assault, Jax couldn't shake the feeling that the Queen was watching, waiting. The air seemed heavier, the distant screeches more deliberate. This wasn't just a battle, it was a test of wills, and Jax was determined to win. The silence after the latest wave of the Xyath attack was almost unbearable. It wasn't peace, it was the calm before the inevitable storm. Jax stood in the battered command center, staring at the hollow map of Velron with a grim determination etched across his face. The Queen's forces had pulled back temporarily, but the fight was far from over. The defenders were weary, their numbers thinning, and the shadows of the Xyath mothership loomed larger with every passing minute. Jax took a deep breath and turned to his team. Mira stood to his right, her armor scratched and scorched, but her eyes as sharp as ever. Kale was to his left, his expression a mixture of resolve and trepidation. Behind them, the remaining survivors and soldiers moved about the room, reloading weapons, treating wounds and reinforcing barricades. They all looked to Jax for guidance, for hope. This is it, Jax said, his voice carrying the weight of what was to come. The Queen is throwing everything she has at us. If we wait for her forces to overwhelm us, we're dead. But if we take the fight to her, we might just have a chance. Mira stepped forward, folding her arms. The tunnels are a death trap, Commander. Even with Kale leading the way, we'll be walking straight into her lair. Jax nodded. I know. But we don't have a choice. The hive is her nerve center. If we destroy it, we cut off her ability to coordinate the swarm. It's the only way. Kyle spoke up, his voice steady. The tunnels are dangerous, but I know them better than anyone. I can get us to the hive. The rest is up to you. Jax glanced at him, appreciating the young leader's courage. You'll lead the way, but I'm taking a point on the charge. Mira, you'll stay here and command the defenses. Hold this position as long as you can. Mira frowned. You're really going in there without me? You're the best tactical mind we have, Jax said. If this place falls while we're gone, everything we're fighting for is lost. I need you here. She hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Fine, but you better make it back, or I'm coming down there to drag you out myself. Jax allowed himself a faint smile. Deal. The team assembled at the entrance to the tunnels, their gear packed and weapons at the ready. It was a small strike force. Jax, Kale, 2 Marines from the Tempest, and a Velronian scout named Isla, who had volunteered to join them. The air was thick with tension as they prepared to descend into the darkness. Kale activated a portable holomap, its faint glow casting eerie shadows across the jagged walls of the tunnel entrance. These tunnels were part of our old energy grid, he explained. They connect to the main hive chamber here. He pointed to a pulsing red marker deep below the city. The Queen will be there. Jax studied the map, his mind racing through possibilities. What about defenses? Traps? Kale nodded. The Xyath use their drones to patrol the tunnels, but they also line the walls with bioorganic traps, spores, webs, things designed to slow you down or worse. You'll need to be careful. Understood, Jax said. He turned to the group. We move quickly and quietly. No unnecessary risks. Our goal is to get in, plant the charges, and get out. Stay close. Watch each other's backs. The team nodded, their faces grim but resolute. With one last glance at the surface, Jax stepped into the tunnels, his weapon at the ready. The others followed, their footsteps echoing softly against the damp, uneven walls. The tunnels were a labyrinth of twisting passageways and suffocating darkness. The air was damp and heavy, laced with the sickly sweet stench of decay. Bioluminescent growths lined the walls, casting an eerie green glow that did little to illuminate the path ahead. Kale led the way, his movements swift and confident despite the oppressive surroundings. Ayla followed close behind, her eyes darting nervously at every sound. Jax stayed near the front, his rifle sweeping the corridor for threats, while the two Marines brought up the rear. The first obstacle came in the form of a thick, web-like substance stretching across the tunnel. The material pulsed faintly, as if alive, and emitted a low hum that set Jax's teeth on edge. "Xyath bioweb," Kale said quietly. "Touch it, and it'll alert every drone in the area." Jax motioned for the team to hold position. He scanned the web, searching for weak points, then gestured for Ayla to hand him a cutting tool. "We'll go through it here, nice and slow." The process was painstaking, every movement deliberate to avoid triggering the web. Jax worked methodically, slicing through the strands with precision. When they finally cleared the obstruction, the team moved on, their pace quickening as the tension grew. As they delved deeper into the tunnels, the ambient sounds grew louder, an unsettling mix of clicking, chittering, and the low, resonant hum of the hive itself. The walls seemed to pulse in time with the sound, as if the entire structure was alive. "We're getting close," Kale whispered. "The hive chamber is just ahead." Jax nodded, his grip tightening on his rifle. "Stay sharp. This is where it gets ugly." The tunnel opened into a massive cavern, its walls covered in writhing organic tendrils that glowed with a sickly green light. In the center of the chamber was the hive itself, a towering, pulsating structure that seemed to radiate malevolence. Drones scuttled across its surface, their movements synchronized as they worked to maintain the hive. And there, at the heart of the hive, was the queen. She was enormous, her grotesque form blending seamlessly with the hive around her. Her many eyes glowed with an unnatural intelligence, and her movements were slow but deliberate, exuding an aura of absolute control. Jax felt a chill run down his spine. "There she is." Kale's voice was barely a whisper. "We plant the charges here. It'll take out the hive and her with it." Jax nodded, motioning for the team to spread out. "Ayla, cover our 6. Kale, you and I will set the charges. Marines, watch the drones. We don't want them interrupting." The team moved with practiced efficiency, placing the explosives at strategic points around the hive. The drones didn't seem to notice them at first, their attention focused on their tasks. But as the final charge was set, the queen stirred. Her massive form shifted, and her many eyes fixed on Jax with a terrifying intensity. A low, guttural sound echoed through the chamber, and the drones froze, their movements halting as if waiting for her command. "Move!" Jax shouted. "Get to the exit now!" The team bolted for the tunnel, but the drones were on them in an instant. The creatures moved with feral speed, their claws raking against the walls as they pursued the intruders. Ayla fired her weapon, taking down 2 drones, but more swarmed in their place. "Keep going!" Jax yelled, his rifle blazing as he covered the retreat. "Don't stop!" The team reached the tunnel entrance, their movements frantic as the charge's timer ticked down. Jax was the last to dive through, firing one final shot before the explosion tore through the hive. The cavern shook violently, a deafening roar echoing through the tunnels as fire and debris consumed the hive. The queen let out a piercing screech, her form engulfed in flames as the hive collapsed around her. The team sprinted through the tunnels, the walls crumbling as the explosion reverberated through the underground structure. By the time they emerged onto the surface, the air was filled with the sound of cheers and the distant rumble of the collapsing hive. Jax collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving as he looked up at the sky. The mothership above seemed to falter, its movements disjointed as the drones on the surface froze and fell lifelessly to the ground. Kyle approached, his expression one of awe and gratitude. "You did it." "The queen is dead." Jax nodded, exhaustion overtaking him. "Not just me, all of us." And as the first rays of sunlight pierced the toxic sky, hope finally broke through the darkness. The ground beneath Velron trembled, not just from the aftershocks of the destroyed hive, but from the rage of the Xyath Queen's remaining forces. Though her hive had fallen, severing her connection to the drones, the Queen herself had survived. Her massive mothership hung ominously in the skies above, pulsating with malignant energy as it prepared for a final, all-out assault on the defenders. In the fortified building, Jax Rylan stood in the midst of controlled chaos. Velronians and humans moved with urgency, setting up their last defenses. The holomap in the center of the room displayed the incoming swarm, massive waves of Xyath forces descending from the mothership, their numbers staggering despite the loss of the hive. "This is everything she's got left," Jax said, his voice calm but firm. "If we hold here, we break her for good. If we don't—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Mira stood beside him, her face streaked with dirt but her eyes sharp. "We're ready, Commander. The barricades are reinforced, turrets are online, and every able fighter is armed and in position. It's not much, but it's what we've got." Jax nodded, his gaze shifting to Kale, who had returned from the hive with him. The young Velronian leader was battered but resolute, his people rallying around him as they prepared for what could be their last stand. Kale stepped forward. "My people have survived this long because we've learned to adapt. With you here, we have something we haven't had in a long time: hope. We'll stand with you, Jax, until the end." Jax placed a hand on Kale's shoulder. "We'll make sure there is no end. Not today." He turned to address the room, his voice carrying above the din. "Listen up. The Xyath are coming with everything they've got. We're outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted. But we're not beaten. They think they can crush us, that we'll break like every other world they've consumed. Let's show them what it means to fight for something worth saving." The room erupted into a determined cheer, a surge of adrenaline fueling the defenders as they took their positions. The first wave hit like a tidal wave of claws and acid. Xyath drones descended from the sky in droves, their grotesque forms blotting out the toxic green light filtering through the clouds. The automated turrets fired relentlessly, cutting down the leading edge of the swarm, but the drones pressed on, their sheer numbers overwhelming the defenses. Jax stood at the front line, his plasma rifle blazing as he directed the battle. "Focus fire on the flyers. Don't let them breach the inner defenses." Kyle and his fighters held the eastern flank, their rudimentary energy weapons glowing brightly as they fired into the swarm. Despite their lack of advanced technology, the Velronians fought with fierce determination, their desperation giving them strength. Mira, stationed near the central barricades, coordinated the automated defenses, barking orders into her comms. "Turrets 2 and 3 are down. Get backup teams on those positions now." Explosions rocked the battlefield as the defenders deployed mines and grenades, each blast carving through the swarms. But for every drone that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place. The Xyath's relentless advance felt more like a natural disaster than an organized assault. "Commander!" Mira's voice crackled over the comms. "We've got a crusher moving on the main barricade. It'll tear through us if we don't stop it." Jax glanced toward the massive creature lumbering toward their position. Its grotesque form radiated toxic mist as it smashed through debris, scattering defenders like rag dolls. "Take it down!" Jax shouted. "All units, focus fire on the crusher!" Plasma rounds and energy blasts converged on the creature, but its thick exoskeleton absorbed much of the damage. Jax grabbed a rocket launcher from a nearby cache and sprinted to the front line, taking aim. "Clear the area!" he yelled, waiting for the defenders to fall back before firing. The rocket streaked through the air and struck the crusher square in the chest. The explosion rocked the battlefield, and the creature let out a guttural screech as it collapsed, its massive body crushing several drones beneath it. A brief cheer went up among the defenders, but Jax quickly silenced them. "Don't stop! Keep holding the line!" As the battle raged on, the Xyath Queen made her move. From the mothership above, a massive beam of green energy lanced toward the defenders, obliterating a section of the eastern wall and sending debris flying in all directions. The shockwave knocked Jax to the ground, and for a moment his ears rang with the deafening roar of destruction. He pushed himself up, coughing through the dust. "Report!" Mira's voice came through the comms, strained but steady. "The eastern wall's gone. We've got drones pouring in. Kale's holding them off, but they won't last long without reinforcements." Jax clenched his jaw, his mind racing. The Queen was escalating, throwing everything at them in a last-ditch effort to crush their resistance. If they didn't act fast, it wouldn't matter how hard they fought. she would overwhelm them. "Carter!" Jax barked into his comms. "Can the Tempest get a shot at that mothership?" Carter's voice crackled through the static. "We've got a clean shot, but it'll take everything we've got. If we miss, we're out of options." "Then don't miss," Jax said. "Light her up." Above the battlefield, the Tempest maneuvered into position, its massive cannons charging with a bright blue glow. The defenders on the ground could feel the hum of energy building as the dreadnought prepared to fire. The mothership seemed to sense the threat, its surface shifting and pulsing as it redirected its forces to defend itself. Drones swarmed toward the Tempest, but the dreadnought's escorts moved to intercept, buying precious seconds for the main ship to line up its shot. "Target locked," Carter reported, "firing in 3, 2, 1. A blinding beam of energy erupted from the Tempest, streaking toward the mothership. The beam struck its target with devastating force, tearing through the alien vessel's organic armor and sending shockwaves rippling across the battlefield. The mothership let out an ear-piercing wail as its structure began to collapse, pieces of it breaking off and plummeting to the ground. The defenders watched in awe as the massive ship faltered, its once ominous form reduced to a fiery wreck. But the victory came at a cost. The Tempest's main power grid overloaded from the shot, leaving the ship vulnerable and unable to provide further support. "The mothership's going down," Mira shouted, "but we're not out of this yet." The Queen, enraged by the destruction of her vessel, unleashed one final wave of drones. The remaining Xyath forces surged toward the defenders, their desperation making them even more feral and dangerous. Jax rallied his team, his voice cutting through the chaos. "This is it. One last push. Hold the line." The defenders fought with everything they had, their combined strength pushing back the swarm inch by inch. Plasma fire, energy blasts, and explosions lit up the battlefield, a dazzling display of defiance against the overwhelming odds. At the center of the fight, Jax faced a towering drone, its spiked limbs slashing through debris as it charged. He sidestepped its attack, firing point-blank into its exposed core. The creature let out a screech before collapsing, but Jax didn't have time to celebrate. He turned to see Kale and Mira holding their ground against the remnants of the swarm, their movements coordinated and unyielding. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last drone fell. The battlefield fell silent save for the crackle of fire and the labored breaths of the survivors. The Xyath were defeated. Jax sank to his knees, his rifle slipping from his hands. He looked around at the battered but victorious defenders and allowed himself a small, weary smile. They had done it. Velron was free. The battlefield was quiet now, save for the distant hum of the collapsing Xyath mothership in the sky above. The defenders stood amidst the rubble, their breaths heavy, their bodies battered but unbroken. For the first time in weeks, the relentless tide of drones had stopped, their grotesque forms littering the ground like broken puppets. But Jax Rylan knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The Queen still lived. The remnants of the Velronian city trembled beneath their feet, the seismic vibrations unmistakable. Something massive stirred deep underground, a final desperate play by the Queen to assert her dominance. Her wrath was palpable, radiating like a wave of malevolence that seemed to infect the very air around them. "She's coming," Jax said, his voice a low growl as he surveyed the remaining fighters. Mira stood beside him, her expression grim but resolute. Kale, bloodied and exhausted, leaned on his weapon but still exuded a quiet determination. Mira was the first to speak. "We've pushed everything she has back, Commander. What's left is her. If we take her out now, it's over." "She'll be at her most dangerous," Kale added, his voice steady despite the fatigue. "A cornered beast is the deadliest." Jax nodded, his expression hardening. "Then we end this. Mira, you're with me. Kale, I need you to hold this position with your people. If we fail—" "You won't," Kale interrupted, his sharp eyes locking on Jax. "We'll hold the line here, no matter what." Jax clasped Kale's arm, a silent acknowledgement of the Velronian's courage. Then, with Mira at his side, he turned toward the entrance to the Queen's underground chamber. The tunnels leading to the Queen's lair were no longer the quiet, eerie passageways Jax had traversed earlier. Now they pulsed with an ominous energy, the walls slick with a bioluminescent substance that seemed alive. The air grew hotter with every step, the oppressive heat pressing against their armor like a suffocating hand. Mira adjusted the settings on her rifle, the faint hum of its energy core filling the silence. "Feels like we're walking into the belly of the beast." "We are," Jax replied. "Stay sharp. She knows we're coming." The tunnel opened into a vast cavern, its walls writhing with organic tendrils that glowed with a sickly green light. At its center stood the Queen, her grotesque form rising high above the ground. She was massive, her lower body fused to the cavern floor, while her upper half writhed with segmented limbs that dripped with viscous fluid. Her many glowing eyes fixed on Jax and Mira, radiating a cruel intelligence. "Humans," the voice echoed in their minds, a guttural, otherworldly hiss that made Mira flinch. "You think you can stop me?" Jax tightened his grip on his rifle. "We don't think. We know." The Queen's laughter reverberated through the cavern, a chilling, hollow sound. "Your kind. So predictable. You fight, you die, yet you return. Always as returning." Jax exchanged a glance with Mira, his jaw tightening. "She's stalling. Keep moving." As they stepped further into the chamber, the Queen's limbs shifted, her movements fluid, yet menacing. The ground beneath them trembled as smaller drones emerged from the walls, their grotesque forms snapping and clicking as they surrounded the humans. "Deal with them," Jax ordered. Mira nodded, raising her rifle and unleashing a volley of plasma fire. The drones screeched as they were cut down, but for every one that fell, another emerged. Jax focused on advancing toward the Queen, his weapon firing with precision as he cleared a path through the swarm. The Queen's voice grew louder, more insistent. "You cannot win. Your resistance is meaningless." "Funny," Jax shot back, his tone icy. "That's what every enemy of humanity says. And yet, here we are." As the last of the drones fell, Jax and Mira found themselves standing at the base of the Queen's massive form. Her limbs twitched with anticipation, her eyes narrowing as she regarded them. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the faint hum of their weapons. The Queen lashed out suddenly, one of her massive limbs crashing down toward Jax. He rolled to the side, the impact shaking the ground and sending shards of rock flying. Mira fired at the limb, her shots searing through its outer layer, but the Queen barely flinched. "She's tough," Mira muttered, her eyes scanning for a weak point. "She's connected to the chamber," Jax said, his voice clipped. "If we take out the tendrils anchoring her, it might weaken her." Mira nodded. "On it." The two moved in tandem, their weapons targeting the pulsating tendrils that spread across the cavern floor. Each shot sent a ripple through the Queen's body, her screeches growing louder with every severed connection. "No!" the Queen's voice roared in their minds. "You will not destroy me!" Jax ignored her, focusing on his task. As they cut through the final tendril, the Queen's massive form sagged, her movements slowing, but even in her weakened state, she was still a formidable foe. The ground trembled again as the Queen reared back, her remaining limbs lashing out in a frenzy. One struck Mira, sending her crashing into the cavern wall with a cry of pain. "Mira!" Jax shouted, rushing to her side. "I'm fine," she groaned, clutching her side. "Finish it." Jax turned back to the Queen, his expression dark. He grabbed the last of his explosives, activating the timer as he sprinted toward her. The Queen's eyes widened, her limbs flailing in a desperate attempt to stop him. "You cannot defeat me!" she roared. "I am eternal." "Not anymore," Jax growled, hurling the explosives at her core. The charges stuck to the Queen's writhing body, their timer ticking down with relentless precision. Jax grabbed Mira, pulling her toward the tunnel as the Queen's enraged screams filled the cavern. "Run!" he shouted. The explosion was deafening, a brilliant flash of light consuming the chamber as fire and debris erupted in all directions. Jax and Mira barely made it out of the tunnel before the shockwave hit, sending them sprawling onto the rubble-strewn ground above. For a moment, there was silence. Then The distant sound of crumbling rock signaled the cavern's collapse. The queen was gone. Jax pushed himself to his feet, his breaths ragged as he surveyed the battlefield. The Velronians and humans who had held the line were now staring at the horizon, where the faint remnants of the mothership's wreckage still glowed against the toxic sky. Kyle approached, his expression one of awe and disbelief. "Is it over?" Jax nodded, his voice hoarse. "It's over." A cheer rose from the defenders, a sound that carried through the ruined city like a beacon of hope. The Xyath had been defeated, their queen destroyed, and Velron was free. Mira leaned heavily on Jax, a tired but triumphant smile on her face. "You did it, Commander." "We did it," Jax corrected, his gaze sweeping over the exhausted but victorious fighters around him. For the first time in weeks, the sun broke through the toxic clouds, casting a golden light over the ruins. It wasn't just the end of a battle, it was the beginning of a new chapter for Velron. And for humanity, it was another reminder of what they were capable of when they refused to back down. The golden light of Velron's twin suns pierced through the thinning toxic clouds, bathing the ruined city in an almost surreal warmth. It was the first time in weeks that the skies had shown any hint of hope, and the sight was enough to draw weary cheers from the surviving defenders. Velron had survived. Against all odds, they had endured. The Xyath queen was dead, and with her demise, the remnants of the swarm had scattered or fallen lifeless where they stood. Jax Rylan stood on a jagged outcropping of rubble, his rifle slung across his back, and his gaze fixed on the horizon. He felt the weight of exhaustion pressing on his shoulders, but he couldn't rest yet. His sharp eyes scanned the wreckage of the battlefield below, where Velronians and humans worked side by side, tending to the wounded, repairing equipment, and gathering the fallen for proper honors. Behind him, Mira approached, her steps uneven but determined. Her armor was scorched, her face streaked with grime, but her spirit remained unbroken. She held a datapad in one hand, the faint glow of its screen reflecting the aftermath. "Casualty reports are still coming in," Mira said, her voice softer than usual. "It's not good. We've lost a lot of people, Velronians and humans alike." Jax nodded but didn't turn around. "We knew the cost going in." "Still," she continued, stepping up beside him, "what we've done here, it's more than just a victory. It's a statement. The Alliance turned its back on this planet, but humanity didn't. That means something." Jax finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. "It does. But it won't bring back the ones we lost." Mira met his gaze, understanding the weight behind his words. She knew Jax well enough to see that he carried the burden of every decision, every sacrifice. It was what made him a great leader, but it was also what haunted him. "You saved a planet, Commander," she said gently. "That has to count for something, too." Down in the heart of the city, Kale Varys stood among his people, his youthful face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes alive with a newfound determination. Around him, Velronian survivors worked to rebuild what little they could, salvaging supplies and patching up the wounded. Despite their losses, there was an unmistakable shift in their demeanor. The despair that had hung over them for weeks was gone, replaced by something far stronger: hope. When Kale spotted Jax and Mira approaching, he straightened, wiping dirt from his hands. The sight of the human commander still standing tall after everything they had endured filled him with gratitude and respect. "You came back," Kale said with a faint smile. "I wasn't sure you would." Jax raised an eyebrow. "After everything we just went through? Not a chance I'd miss the aftermath." Kyle chuckled softly, though the sound was tinged with weariness. "We owe you more than we can ever repay. Without you, without your people, we'd all be—" "Don't finish that sentence," Jax interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "You held your ground when no one else would. We didn't save you. You saved yourselves. We just gave you the tools to finish the fight." Kale studied him for a moment before nodding. "Maybe, but you gave us something we thought we'd lost forever. Faith that we could fight back." Mira folded her arms, a glimmer of pride in her eyes. "He's right, you know. You've got the makings of a great leader, Kyle. Don't waste it." The young Velronian hesitated, then extended a hand to Jax. "Whatever comes next, Velron won't forget this, and we won't forget humanity." Jax shook his hand, the gesture simple but meaningful. "Then make sure your people have a future worth remembering." As the sun climbed higher, the survivors began to gather in what remained of Velron's central plaza. The towering spires that once symbolized their thriving civilization now lay in ruins, but even in their shattered state, they served as a reminder of resilience. The Velronians and humans stood side by side, united not just by survival, but by the bonds forged in battle. Kyle took the makeshift stage first, his voice steady as he addressed his people. "Today we stand on the ashes of our past, but we also stand on the foundation of our future. The Xyath thought they could destroy us, but they were wrong. We are still here, and we are stronger than ever." A wave of cheers rippled through the crowd, a sound that resonated with defiance and hope. Jax stepped forward next, his presence commanding as he surveyed the crowd. He hadn't planned on speaking, but the moment demanded it. "Humanity doesn't give up," he began, his voice carrying across the plaza. "It's in our nature to fight for what we believe in, to stand up when others won't. That's why we came here, not because it was easy, not because it was safe, but because it was the right thing to do." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "The Alliance turned its back on you, but we didn't. And now, Velron is free. That's a victory we earned together, not just for today, but for every day that comes after." The cheers grew louder, the unity between the two groups more evident than ever. Jax stepped back, his expression softening as he watched the crowd. For a brief moment, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. They had done what seemed impossible, and now Velron had a chance to rebuild. Later, as the cleanup efforts continued, Jax found himself back aboard the Tempest, standing in the observation deck. The ship was still battered from the fight, its systems running on emergency power, but it was still standing, just like the people it had protected. Mira joined him, leaning against the railing as she gazed out at Velron below. The planet's surface was scarred, but its skies were clearer than they'd been in weeks. "Think they'll make it?" she asked. "They have to," Jax replied. "They've been through hell and back, but they're still standing. That counts for something." Mira glanced at him. "And you? What's next for you, Commander?" Jax was silent for a moment, his gaze distant. "We'll head back to the Alliance. They need to know what happened here, and they need to know what we're capable of." A faint smirk tugged at Mira's lips. "You're going to make a few enemies doing that." "Good," Jax said simply. "They need to remember why they brought us into their shiny little club in the first place." Mira laughed softly, the sound light against the heavy silence. "You know, for a guy who doesn't like speeches, you're pretty good at inspiring people." "Don't get used to it," Jax said, though there was a hint of warmth in his voice. They stood in silence for a while, watching as the Velronians below began to rebuild their shattered world. For the first time in weeks, the future didn't feel like an impossible dream. As Jax turned to leave, he glanced back at the planet one last time. His final words were quiet, almost to himself. "Hope isn't given, it's built, one fight at a time." And with that, he walked away, leaving behind a world that was stronger because of him, and a legacy that would endure long after he was gone.